Hi, welcome to Rex's Bible Minute, weekly video where we talk about Jesus, Christianity, and anything along those lines. We are in week 20 of our study of Revelation. This is a long study, but I've kind of warned you guys before we started about this that Revelation would not be quick. But we're over halfway done, so that's really good. Like we're in chapter 11 now. But we're starting to get into some really, really out there kind of stuff. Like it's been a little strange already. Like there's no, I'm not trying to downplay what we've studied so far, but now this is where things really start to get a little different. And opinions can get pretty strong about what they mean. So as we go through this, again, remember that the entire purpose of Revelation was simply to encourage Christians who are suffering by showing them that God cares about their current suffering, by going through, but He cares about what's happening to them. He understands. He's not just oblivious to it. Like He understands exactly what's happening to these struggling Christians in the first century, and He's encouraging them by giving them how things are going to be brought about at the end, about how God is going to make all things right. He's going to bring His justice on the earth. And so, you know, if you get caught up in the minutia and the details, in the this has to mean this has to mean that, like, I mean, seek truth. I'm not trying to dissuade that, but like to maintain your unity. I mean, really, that's it. Like as we go through this, we're starting to go on the downhill slope of this study. Maintain our unity. We're allowed to disagree on what this means. I'm teaching you the way I understand it because that's what I have to do. I very much accept that I could be wrong on some things. But when it comes to Revelation and the way things are going to end and all of that, I'm going to try to do my best to do what I think is true and the most accurate. But these aren't salvation issues. You know, these aren't things that are really going to have an impact. Like if studying Revelation, if you somehow knew exactly how everything was going to end, how everything was going to wrap up, if you live your life following Jesus the way we're supposed to, it shouldn't change a thing about it. It really shouldn't. You should live your life 100% ready to go right now, because you could. You're way more likely to go right now than you are in the apocalypse. Like that's just statistically speaking, that's the truth. So I don't get caught up in that, and I hope you don't either. I hope that this is eye-opening to you, and most of all, this is encouraging to you, because we live in a world that's very opposed to the Christian way of doing things, and there are mechanisms, there are organizations, there are structures in our culture and in our society that very much are at odds with us. And so this should be encouraging to us as well, as people who are more and more every single day pushed to the fringes of our society, of our culture, to a point that I really believe, not to be alarmist or anything, but I really think that there's going to be a time in the near future when we're really, really going to empathize with those first century Christians, that things really are going to be difficult for those people who try to stay true to their faith in Jesus and follow Him. So let's go ahead and read our section, and we're going to be in chapter 11, verses 1 through 14, and then we'll break it down like we always do. So let's read it. Starting in verse 1, it says, "Then a measuring rod like a staff was given to me." This is John talking. He says, Get up," said a voice, "and measure God's temple and the altar and those who are worshiping in it. But leave out the outer court of the temple. Don't measure it. It is given to the nations, and they will trample the holy city for 42 months. Let me just stop there. Okay, we're going to do it a little different this week. Let's break it down as we read it. So he starts out, this is John talking, and we're in his delaying interludes, right? If you remember from last week, that's the fancy way of saying these are side stories, right? Like I'm a big fan of Marvel movies. And part of the reason for that is because I read comic books some growing up, but also I watched like the Spider-Man and the Batman TV shows after school as a kid in the 90s. And so when they started coming out with those the Marvel movies, you know, Captain America, Hulk, or all those, like I got really invested and I started watching them. And that was like in the 2000s, right? Like that was, I think 2007 was when the first one came out. It's 2022, right? Like, I have invested serious time in these movies. And part of the brilliance of them, the reason that they make so much money is for two reasons. Number one, you have to watch them all, right? Like, you have to watch every movie to get the overarching story that's been happening. Like, it's not just, like, you can't tell the whole story in one movie. And then the other thing that's brilliant is you have to watch them all because you have to understand who the characters are. So as you watch these movies and they go along, and the first movie they really built to was the Avengers movie, right? The Avengers are a team of superheroes. And when you write a movie, you have to give your characters a backstory. You have to give your characters meaning and purpose. You have to give them a reason for people to be interested in them and care about them. And so Marvel was genius in the fact that they set up these individual movies as they told this bigger overarching theme. And so you had Iron Man, you had Captain America, you had Hulk, you had Thor, all these individual solo movies, but they all were progressively moving the larger story forward until you got to the Avengers, and that's when now all these people come together and this awesome thing, and everybody knew it was coming, and everybody was really excited about it. That's kind of what John is doing here. A delaying interlude is like one of those solo movies. Right? It moves the story forward a little bit, but it's really there to give you backstory as to what's happening with the other characters, especially one major character. John is doing that here in this delaying interlude. So last week, we saw a delaying interlude about John's prophetic calling, why he was called to be a prophet, and what that kind of means, and it's displayed through this vision. This is part 2 of that, and this is one of the most confusing sections of the Bible, but here John sees a vision that shows the life of a prophet, but even more so the life of a church. And so he's given this measuring rod to measure the temple, right? Now, the temple that he's talking about is not the heavenly temple, right? That's where he's at, right? Like we saw the first part of Revelation takes place on the island of Patmos. He has the visions, the 7 letters. Second part takes place in the throne room of heaven within the temple. That's not what he's measuring, right? This is a throwback to past prophets, right? So Zechariah and Ezekiel both talk about measuring the temple. And what this did was the temple was the space between holy and profane. Okay, so you had God's space in the Holy of Holies, and then you had God's people space in the temple building and the outer temple building, the priest space, and then you have all these layers. The temple was very much like an onion, but the boundaries of it was this is holy space and everything else isn't, right? This is holy, this is profane. And so when the temple was set up, it was measured so that it would be marked where the boundaries were. When the temple was rebuilt after the Babylonian captivity, it was remeasured. Ezekiel and Zechariah both talk about this. And so John is demarcating the boundary between the holy and the unholy. This is a big clue for us because there's a lot of people who like to take the story of the 2 witnesses that we're reading right now and say it's about this or about some future event or this or that. The temple in the New Testament is the church. Like, you can't really argue against it. And so if John is measuring the temple here, he's measuring what's holy. And what's holy is the church. That is God's temple now. We don't have the actual physical temple now. It went away in 70 AD, most likely before this letter was written. The temple, from very early on, by Christians was viewed as themselves, the dwelling place of God. The Holy Spirit dwells within us. So John is told to measure the temple, except for the outer court. And so if you actually went to the temple or you look up what the temple looked like, there was, like I said, there was onions. You had the Holy of Holies, then you had the place where the high priest went, and then the priests only, and then the men, and then Jewish men and women of families, and then you had the outer courts, and it just layers and layers, and depending on who you were, determined on how far into the temple you could go. And so John says here, he says, don't measure the outer court, don't measure it. It is given to the nations. They will trample the holy city for 42 months. Okay, so we see here that John is told to measure this. He's measuring the church, right? This is the holy place. The holy place is Christ, and then by extension, his people, because what is done for Christ is done for his people. That's biblical, basic Christian theology. But we see that the outer court, where the Gentiles are, is to be handed over and it'll be trampled by the non-holy. So it's not demarcated within. You have these part of God people, and they're going to trample it for 42 months, right? Now, 42 months is 3.5 years. If you remember from our past studies, 7 is a very significant number in the Bible. It is the number of completion. It's the number of fulfillment. It's God's number. It is perfect. Things are perfect, complete. Anytime you see something that is 3.5, that's a broken 7. Right, so this is showing that the time is not complete, that this is an imperfect time
That's what this number means. Anytime you see anything that represents 3.5 or 42 months, that means it's a broken time, right? So this is a flawed time. Continuing on in verse 3, he says, I will give my 2 witnesses for the task of prophesying, clothed in sackcloth for those 1,260 days. Okay, so these 2 witnesses, okay, there's a couple of significant things about this. Number one, the fact that there are 2. Deuteronomy and Jewish law in general has always held that in order for anything to be considered credible, you required 2 witnesses, right? It couldn't just be the voice of one witness. You had to have 2. So there are 2 witnesses, right? That makes this legally credible, right? So John is speaking from a Jewish background, okay? And then he says they're dressed in sackcloth. Now, what is sackcloth? Sackcloth is it's what in the Jewish world and still to this day in parts of the Middle Eastern world and tribal societies, the way you dress signifies where your heart is, right? What you're feeling. And so you'll see throughout the Bible a lot of times they'll say they put on sackcloth and they rubbed ashes on their hair or they rubbed ashes on their face. They were showing through what they were wearing how they were feeling. And it was typically a moment of grief or loss or hurt or heartache. It's a sign of contrition, basically. And so these 2 witnesses who are about to preach and prophesy, really think of them as prophets, they're dressed as a sign of contrition. That they're not necessarily grieving, but they're showing humility, right? They're not dressed and not dressed to the nines. They're not dressed, really nice to show the world how arrogant and prideful they are. They're dressed in the clothing of humility, right? Sackcloth, the cheapest clothing you can get. And they're going to be there for this evil age, this broken age, right? So 1,260 days is 42 months. It's 3.5 years. That's what that is. So that's what all these numbers are. This age, this time frame that John is seeing a vision of is a broken age. It's a broken 7. It is a broken time. So continuing on in verse 4, he says, these are the 2 olive trees, the 2 lampstands, which stand before the Lord of the earth. If anyone wants to harm them, fire comes out of their mouth and devours their enemies. So if anyone wants to harm them, that is how such a person must be killed. These 2 have authority to shut up the sky so that it will not rain during the days of their prophecy. They will have authority over the waters to turn them into blood and to strike the earth with any plague as often as they see fit. Okay, so that right there should give us even more clues about who these are. All right, so if you remember from way back in the beginning of Revelation, our study, we saw that there were 7 lampstands, and then we saw that there were 2 olive trees. These are callbacks again to the prophets of old. And so if you want to go back, I think it was the second or probably like the 3rd or 4th week, as Jesus is introduced in chapter 1, we see these are very specific callbacks to prophecies. So the 2 olive trees, they represented Joshua and Zerubbabel, the ideal king and the ideal priest, right? So these are very specific callbacks. And then the lampstands, if you remember, those were the churches, right? So Jesus warned in his letter, he said, I will remove your lampstand, right? The lampstand shining light. And so what we're seeing here is that John is identifying these 2 prophets, these 2 witnesses, as representatives of Christ, essentially. He's not calling them Christ themselves, but they're representative of Christ. Because who is Christ? He is our King. He is our great high priest. He is the light of the world. And so these 2 witnesses, in a sense, they represent the church. They represent prophets. They represent people who witness on behalf of Jesus. And then the things that they can do are further proof of that, because they're very famous things that prophets have done. So the ability to cast out fire, to call down fire, that is Elijah. Like that is what Elijah did on Mount Carmel. He called down fire and it burned up the altar, including the rocks. If you remember your story from there, I believe it's 2 Kings, or maybe 1 Kings. Sorry, I don't have that written down for some reason. But anyways, that is an Elijah thing. This is a very famous prophetic event that they are now able to do themselves. And then turning water into blood, that is something Moses did during the Exodus. Like, these are very famous callbacks to prophets. So these witnesses, they're witnessing to Christ. We see that through the lampstands and through the olive trees, and they're prophets because we see that through the powers. This is all vision showing in context with the first delaying interlude of John's prophetic calling about why he's a prophet, how he's a prophet. This is what prophets have done through the church age. That's essentially what we're seeing here. We're seeing a picture of the church age. And so for this first part, we'll call this Act 1, to quote Dr. Mangina. Act 1 is essentially Jesus' earthly mission, right? When Jesus was here on earth during this time, it was successful. Nobody could stop what Jesus was doing. All the powers of earth tried to stop him. The ruling Jewish authorities, the Roman authorities, the populace, the people, the crowds, like nobody could stop him. Everything he did, he was successful at for those 3 years. All right, so we see 3.5 years, 3 years. Like this is the time that John is seeing here. This is representing Christ, the first part, Christ's ministry on earth. But then things take a radical turn, right? And so starting at verse 7, it says, "And when they have completed their testimony," sharing what they know about Jesus, right? "The monster that comes from the abyss will make war on them and will defeat them. And their bodies will lie in the streets of the great city, which is spiritually called Sodom and Egypt, where their Lord was crucified. Their bodies will be seen by the peoples, tribes, languages, and nations for 3.5 days, and they will not allow their bodies to be buried in the tomb. The inhabitants of the earth will celebrate over them and make merry and send presents to one another, because these two prophets tormented those who live on the earth." So Act 1, nothing can stop them. Act 2, it's a quick war, right? So what does this mean? First off, this is our first glimpse of a couple things that are really going to start to become prominent in the next several chapters. We see the monster that comes from the abyss. We talked about the abyss. The abyss is human depravity, right? The abyss is humans' capacity for evil. And out of it, monstrous things come. We saw the scorpions. They come from, the evil, human evil. Well, here we see the monster come out and it wages war on these two prophets, the representatives of Christ, the church. And they win, as they have throughout all of history. The entire church age, the world has waged war on the church, and the church is unstoppable, but we also are killed. We suffer. We die. But hold on to that thought, because it comes up in the next passage we're going to read. But then we see the great city. And the great city is something that's going to come up more and more. But it is called spiritual Sodom. What is that? Sodom, if you remember from your Old Testament studies, it was a city, an actual city. There's archaeological records of it. Sodom and Gomorrah. These were cities that were evil. I mean, just full on, absolute evil. Like, they were so evil that God said, I'm not gonna wait and let them destroy themselves, because that's typically what God does. When evil shows its face, he just lets them destroy themselves, because that's what evil does. It ends up destroying itself. These were such evil cities that God said, I can't let that survive, and he wiped them off the face of the earth. That's how evil Sodom was. What is Egypt? Egypt, if you remember the Exodus stories, is the source of oppression and slavery. That is where the people of Israel were enslaved. And so he's saying that the sources of evil and depravity, they're the places where Christians will suffer the most. Put this back in the context of that first century church, and you see, that's where they live. They live in these Roman cities that celebrate the things that we have the record of Sodom and Gomorrah doing. They celebrate those things. They celebrate slavery. They celebrate oppression. They celebrate these things. And for Christians to preach what Jesus taught them, it's going to be difficult for people to hear who celebrate those things. And so we see that after the witnesses are killed, that the people celebrate and give each other's presents because they're so excited that they don't have to deal with these people anymore. They're gone. But verse 11 says, "And after 3.5 days, the Spirit of life from God came into them, and they stood up on their feet, and great fear fell on all who saw them. And they heard a loud voice from heaven. 'Come up here,' it said, and they went up to heaven on a cloud with their enemies looking on. And at that moment there was a huge earthquake, and 1/10 of the city fell, and 7,000 of the people were killed by the earthquake. And the rest were very much afraid and glorified the God of heaven." So we see that they don't stay dead. You can't defeat the church. You might physically kill us, but you can't keep us dead. No matter what, the church rolls on. The church marches on, to quote that old hymn. You can't stop the church. And so despite their celebrating, despite their murdering, despite their destroying everything about the church and its witnesses, God rules the day. I mean, the reality of it is, if you truly believe in the message of Jesus, death isn't scary. I mean, I'm not saying it doesn't have, well, I guess I am saying it doesn't have power. Like, yes, you die, but you know what? You're going to come back to life. Like, that's literally what we believe as Christians, that death is not a final end. Like, death has no power anymore. Yes, we die, but so what? Like, we come back. Like, that is the teaching of Christianity, that we don't stay dead. And if we die, we go to a place called paradise in the meantime until we're brought back to life. And when we're brought back to life, we have an eternal body that never decays, that never breaks down, that never hurts. I'm just saying, like, death has no power according to the Christian. And that should be, like, that should change your worldview. That should change your life. That doesn't mean you have to be, like, you know, risking it all every day as far as like your physical life, but it means that death has no power. So the ultimate threat that the world had against everybody, especially those in power, has no weight anymore. It's not a real threat. Kill us, okay, we'll come back. That's literally what Jesus taught. And so we see it here, that the church cannot be defeated even by death. And so after they're brought back, it says, come up here and be with us. A voice says, come up, and they're brought up to heaven. And then at that moment, there was a huge earthquake. And this is what we're seeing here at the end of the age. So at the end of this thing, if we think of Act 1 as Jesus' earthly ministry, Act 2 as the church age, Act 3 is what happens in the end. So essentially, this is a mini picture of all of the church age. Act 1, Jesus did his thing on the earth. He gets killed. After that, we preach, we teach, we're in the church age, we're suffering. Act 3, God makes things right. God sets things right. There's destruction, there's chaos, there's calamities, like we've been reading in the septenaries, those sets of 7. At the end, we see all those things, but God makes things right at the end. And then the very last verse of this section says, the second woe is past, the third woe is coming very soon. We'll talk more about the woes when we get to the third one. But basically, we see in this section a mini picture of all of Revelation. And on top of that, we see it from a prophet's perspective. So think of the end, chapter 10 and the first half of chapter 11 is kind of like John's solo movie in the Marvel set of movies, right? Like it's John the Apostle, John the Revelator, you know, whatever you want to call it. But the point is, this is John cluing us into his perspective, how he has seen things, how he understands things. That you have people who go and they share and they witness, and they witness for Jesus. But in the end, they're going to be made right. The world will try to kill them. The world will kill them. And you know what? A prophet's job, you can't stop him all the way to the end. And so that should encourage you, right? That should be encouraging that as we live within the reality that, hey, death has no power over us anymore. Like it isn't a final end. We should be doing all we can to share with the world around us. It should set your expectations. You know, it's not going to be pretty. The world's not going to like what you have to say. But when you tell the truth, you say, hey, there is a God who loves you. So much so that he sent his son so that you could be made right and spend eternity to live in the awesome place that he creates for you, so you can be part of his people, to always have family and community, so that you can live in his presence, ask him your questions, find the answers to all things. That's the most exciting news in history. And the fact is that we've won. Like, let this be an encouragement to you. Again, I can't overemphasize it, that the point of Revelation is to encourage you, not to get you caught up in divisions, not to get you caught up in worrying about, is this detail right, is that detail right? Like, the point is to be encouraged that Christ wins, and therefore what is done for Christ is done for us. We win too. If you have any questions, reach out. Otherwise, see you next week.